Well, thank you very much, and good evening to everybody. Just as I was introduced, my name is Andrej Mahecic. I'm with UNHCR office in London, and tonight I will talk to you about the current crisis, the current refugee crisis in Europe, but I will actually speak a bit broadly also, as to understand what's happening in Europe, we also have to look a bit broader. I hope you can all hear me and that this microphone is working. I work for an organization which was set up after the Second World War with one particular task. It was meant to deal with the refugee crisis in Europe after the Second World War, in the aftermath of the Second World War. Now, it was supposed to be a temporary organization. However, the history has clearly proved everybody wrong, because the second half of the 20th century, and certainly the beginning of this millennium, has been marked by many conflicts and situations causing forced displacement around the world. So UNHCR has been dealing with that since the Second World War. And the mandate that we have has been given to the organization by the General Assembly, and it's very simple. Essentially, it's to protect and assist refugees and to work with the government to find solutions to their plight. So everything that I'll be saying tonight about the subject, this is the angle I'm coming from. And to move on to the first, where do I point this? Okay. The first slide, and I believe you remember this image. This is actually an artistic interpretation of a photograph, which most of you, I believe, had seen on the cover pages of most of the dailies across Europe in late August. This is a 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi who was basically found. His body was found on a beach in Turkey after the boat he was on with his family had a shipwreck, and essentially many of the people on that boat died. It was basically a death of a toddler, of a 3-year-old boy, that brought the attention to not only to the scope, but perhaps also to the depth of the tragedy, and has made perhaps the audiences in Europe, where, although this issue has been present on our screens, it certainly has brought home to many of us the scope of the tragedy. So an island was only one of more than 3,000 people, 3,000 souls that perished at sea this year alone. Now, why is this important, and why should we care? Before I go there, let me just say that the movement across the Mediterranean is not a new phenomenon. It has been going on for years, but certainly the nature of the movement has changed profoundly this year. It already started to change last year. Let's say up until 2014, the movement could have been characterized as a migratory movement, where most of the people on the move were actually trying to make a journey to Europe in search of opportunities, jobs, in a way with their ambition to improve their lives. Many of the refugees have also used the same routes, and this is why we would usually refer to this as a mixed migratory route. But while in the years before this has been very much characterized by the economic migration, already last year, and in particular this year, this movement is marked by a very strong, dominant refugee narrative. And if we look at the numbers of those crossing the Mediterranean, well, these are the figures for this year. More than 700,000 made the perilous journey across the Mediterranean so far. Many of them more than half are Syrians. Another 14% are Afghans. Another 6% are Iraqis. Another 5% are Eritreans. If I just add the first 3 or 4 nationalities, they all come from the countries ravaged by war, conflict, violence, and persecution. And this is what is actually driving that movement. It's not the idea of betterment, of improving your lives. It is actually running for your life. And in order to understand what we are looking at here and why this has happened this year in Europe, we have to look beyond. And we have to look beyond the immediate region, and we have to look at what is happening globally. So we are living in an era when the size of the global displacement, of the forced global displacement, is at its highest levels after the Second World War. It is a shocking fact. It is also important to note that this number includes not only refugees, they constitute about 20 million of this number. It includes 38 million people who are internally displaced. In other words, they are in a refugee-like situation, but they have not crossed the international border. They are still within their own country. Then there are about 2 million asylum seekers. Then there are also stateless people around the world. So this is the scope of the problem we are currently dealing with. And just to put it in a perspective, this means that last year, on average, more than 42,000 people were forced to leave their homes. In a week, that's a city of the size of Brighton in the UK. So just to understand the scope of what is happening. And a lot of this, and essentially all of it, is driven by the conflicts. And over the past 5 years, there have been 15 new conflicts or conflicts that have been reignited. And these are the main drivers of this sudden and considerable increase in the forced displacement. A lot of it is driven by Syria, and if you look at this graph, I think it's quite telling. The graph also, this map also tells another story, which is a very important one. It speaks first of all, of the inability of the international community to prevent new conflicts. A case in point, Syria, for example, Ukraine, Central African Republic. It also shows the inability or incapacity of the international community to end the old conflicts. A case in point here, the situations in Somalia, the situations in Afghanistan, still producing massive number of refugees. And lastly, it points out the serious deficit of peace in the world today. A lot of this, as I said, is driven by Syria. And the situation in Syria can be described in 3 words. It's death, it's destruction, and it's displacement. This is the country where the half of the population now is uprooted. More than 4 million Syrians are currently living as refugees in the neighboring Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. Another 7.6 million Syrians are displaced within their own country. And they have been displaced for more than a year, and they have been displaced for more than once. You have to understand that the last months in Syria have been particularly brutal. We are talking about the country where there is not a single town or village that has been untouched by the conflict. We are talking about the country where the value of the national currency has decreased by 90% since the beginning of the conflict. We are talking about the conflict that has killed 250,000 of people. We are talking also about the country where the price of bread in some parts have increased tenfold in the past several months, where the mills are no longer producing flour, where the electricity is available maybe 2, perhaps 4 hours a day, where more than 15,000 medical staff, and here I'm talking about doctors and trained nurses, are estimated to have left the country. Now imagine if 15,000 medical staff walked out of the NHS in that period. What would be the impact on the population? We are also seeing reappearance, for example, of the diseases that were eradicated in Syria, such as polio, for example. These are very serious consequences, and the very fabric of the Syrian society is now being torn apart. And just to give you some idea of the level of the destruction, let me show you this satellite imagery of one of the neighborhoods of Hama. And this is the satellite image taken towards the end of September 2012. In less than 2 months, this neighborhood looks as if you are looking at lunar surface. There's not a brick on brick left standing. What is the situation in the neighboring countries? Well, it's equally dire. Although there is safety, the neighboring countries are now buckling under the massive pressure of the Syrian refugee crisis. And it is important to understand that these levels are unsustainable. The countries in the region are at the tipping point. Lebanon alone is hosting more than 1 million Syrian refugees. That's 25% of the country's population. Jordan is hosting more than 600,000. That's more than 10% of the Jordanian population. Turkey has become, in less than a year, a country with the largest refugee population in the world, with more than 2 million Syrian refugees registered on its soil. And Iraq, which has suffered a massive spillover in the course of 2014 and this year. And the conditions that the Syrian refugees are facing there, as we are now stepping into the 5th winter of the conflict, is the following. There is a loss of hope because there is no signs that the conflict back home is abating. So the idea and the hope that you would go home very soon is fading away. 2, the loss of livelihoods. First of all, it is very difficult to find work. Most of the refugees are in very poor areas of the neighboring countries, competing often with the local labor market. Many of the refugees have been forced to basically sell whatever they have. So once the family, whatever they had, the family silver is gone, if you like, you are actually starting to grow your debt. They can't afford to pay rent because, remember this, unlike what the perception is that most of the Syrian refugees are being accommodated in camps. On the contrary, 82% of Syrian refugees are staying with the host communities. They're staying with the communities where they are with relatives, with friends, with acquaintances, or they're renting on their own. But this is now becoming more and more difficult by the day. The money's running out. People are skipping meals in order to make ends meet. The children are not being sent to school because the parents can't afford for the bus or the uniform or the books or the food. And there is the whole negative element that comes with it. How do you cope with this? Syrian children are now being sent to beg instead of sitting in school and learning, or they work in the fields. There are early marriages. There are many, many negative elements in this. The international aid also is no longer able to keep up with the needs. No matter how generous the donors have been, the needs are far outstretching what is actually currently available. The refugee appeal for 2015 is currently funded at 45%. We are in November of this year. So lastly, some of those who basically losing all and having a feeling that they have nothing more to lose are now making a desperate journey towards Europe. And make no mistake, most of the Syrians who are staying in the region have no such means, okay? So the numbers, although relatively appearing high in the graph I showed earlier, are minuscule compared to what is the actual scope of the crisis in the region. Which brings us back to Europe. And what have been UNHCR asking the countries in the neighborhood to do? First of all, rescue at sea. It's essential. It does save lives. We have seen that with the Mare Nostrum operation that was managed by the Italian Navy in 2014, which had to stop because of the lack of funds. After the drownings in April, the European Union finally brought back into place a new search and rescue operation which is saving lives. And it's a proof that a collective European response, when coordinated and genuinely collective response, can make a difference. Considering the numbers that have crossed and the numbers that have perished, there's a clear proof. Second, we have called on the European governments to consider sharing the responsibility, because there are two untenable things currently happening in Europe. First of all, Greece and Italy cannot cope on their own with such numbers. Greece alone has received more than 600,000 arrivals so far this year. With the current economic crisis and with the current pressure on Greece, Greece alone cannot cope with this scope of a problem. Equally so, another situation is developing elsewhere in Europe, where most of the asylum applications are being lodged in Germany and Sweden. And this is equally so untenable in the long run. Another element is the legal avenues, because people are resorting to these rickety boats as they feel they have no alternative. And there is something profoundly wrong when those who are fleeing one of the most dramatic and deadliest conflicts in recent history have no other ways of reaching safety in Europe but boarding the boats managed by smugglers. We have also said that it's important to have in place a robust procedures to identify who are the people who are arriving and what their needs are, because based on the needs, the different solutions will be offered. And for those in need of protection, the protection should be granted. But for those who may not need protection and will have no way of regulating their stay in Europe, it is important that there is a humane, safe and organized way of returning. It goes to the very integrity of the asylum in Europe, because in our view, the protection needs to be granted to those who really need it. Lastly, the relocation. The relocation. The relocation is something that the European nations have agreed to discuss, especially after the first image that I've shown you when of island Kurdi. There was an earlier agreement to have 40,000 people that would be relocated from Greece and Italy in order to alleviate the pressure. In September, additional 120,000 slots have been agreed. This is essential because those who are arriving and in need of protection should be benefiting from a safe and caring environment in Europe. And the relocation scheme is currently meant for 3 nationalities only: for Syrians, for Iraqis, and for Eritreans. These are the nationalities that have a very high recognition rate as refugees in Europe, meaning 75% or higher. And speaking of Europe and the relocation, 59 years ago, in the course of the Hungarian uprising and the Soviet intervention at the time, 200,000 Hungarians fled the country, fled to the neighboring Austria and neighboring what was the former Yugoslavia at the time. It took only 3 months for the world to relocate and resettle 140,000 Hungarians. There was no European Union, there was no Schengen at the time, and yet this was possible. Because there was a sense and the idea and the concept of the international cooperation and working together. And that lies at the very core. The basic principle of the international protection for refugees is based on the idea of the international cooperation. I'm bringing this up because these are the images that we are seeing today across Europe. Countries trying to deal with this on their own. There is chaos. There is sometimes violence, increasing the anxiety, the fears, and the suffering of those who are seeking protection. And we have to ask ourselves also, are these the values that Europe cherishes, the values of the primacy of the reason, the enlightenment, the tolerance? Because these will be the images that the future generations will judge how Europe treated the people and those most vulnerable in the society. And to end on a note, this is somebody who's of your age. She's a Syrian, and her name is Tamara. And I'm bringing her picture for one reason, because in many refugee situations you will see on the screen people taking whatever they can. With Syrians, there is something very particular. In many situations, the belongings that they had with them were often the betraying element, because you never know who you're going to encounter on the next checkpoint, and whether your belongings will be the telltale sign that you are trying to leave the country. So many of them actually left with almost nothing, with perhaps one or two things. And we asked many of them what those are. Now, she's 21. And the only thing she brought were her school certificates, because she desperately wants to join back school and work. And you can see her in two ways. She can be Syria's future, or she can be the embodiment of Syria's lost generation. Thank you very much.
Andrej just told me it was too long, but I think the subject was worth the length. Thank you, Andrej. Before introducing our next speaker,